The Hacker's Last Run. Schematics of Subversion. By Elton Gar. Kai drove the 2-inch metal spike into their neck, connecting themselves to the grid, and almost immediately forgetting their body in the physical world, except for lingering awareness that it wasn't entirely safe. They had found a small closet near the mainframe, close enough for the stolen spike to allow them access. But if a janitor or security found the body, there was nothing they could do. Not that they could do much if they were awake. Kai had a jailbroken gun at home, but without the tech that would make it invisible to the networks, it was a liability. Omniscient security would know it was there and find them, so what they had was a knife. For now, the best choice was to focus on the situation at hand. And that was getting into the corporation's grid, finding what they needed, and getting out safely. They were good, one of the best hackers in the city, but none of that was guaranteed. There were no guarantees in Syliscape. At least not if you were born in the slums. Instead, you learned to play the odds, and if you survived to become an adult, you got good at it. This grid didn't have the comfort features of one of the public grids. There was no fake sky or billboards attempting to extract the last drop of blood out of the stones that were the wallets of the people who lived their lives in those virtual spaces. Instead, the sky was black. A starless night cut into sections by the soft glowing red lines that reminded anyone in a corporate grid that this was a restricted space. A space that would have already burned out their connection, and possibly more, if the person who had sold Kai the spike had been lying about its quality. They trusted Thetch as much as anyone, but survival was survival, and if he hadn't been able to get a real spike, they wouldn't have really blamed Thetch if he had sold them a fake. Though if they lived, they would have forced him to pay for the repairs. Closer to them were dozens of perfectly rectangular buildings of polished silver. Whoever made this place certainly hadn't focused on aesthetics. It only took a few minutes to put some digital trees into the environment, but they suspected the programmer knew what Omniscient wanted more than Kai and had given it to them, even if it was an inferior product. Before they moved forward, Kai looked down at their avatar. It was the same one they used in the public spaces. Androgynous with a mix of fashions that were designed to confuse more than to define Kai. Having lived half their life in the digital world, the idea of being constrained to the biology of their body was uncomfortable. That was one of the reasons they had begun augmenting themselves as soon as they could afford it. But Kai couldn't do that here, so they loaded one of the default avatars. A white man in a black suit with a black tie and a briefcase. The appearance was one that could fool anyone, including the digital security that was everywhere in this place. But below the surface, all the clothes and even the flesh of the avatar had been augmented. That was important, because trying to create anything inside a corporate grid was dangerous. Every corp had different rules, and while they knew some of the things that would trip Omniscient security, they didn't know everything. Most of it was simple defense. The suit and even the tie were resistant to most digital attacks. That wasn't perfect, of course. The amount of data it took to put in any resistance was exorbitant, and so you had to guess. More important was the briefcase. It was filled with small tools they might need. But more importantly, the interior was hidden from the local grid. That hadn't been easy or cheap. If it had just shown as nothing, it would have triggered every bot in the grid that something was being hidden. So it had to show it was entirely normal while being something else entirely. That meant nesting one set of code inside the other without the routine scans noticing. A tricky piece of work that had saved them more than once. They walked forward without slowing, trying their best to look like they were supposed to be here, as they passed a 15-foot-tall metal machine that had clearly been designed by someone who hadn't spent enough time in grids to understand how they worked. The size wouldn't help it in any way, and would certainly hinder it in others. But it also didn't need to be humanoid or even have eyes to see. The massive gun it carried was also absurd. There were guns in the grid, of course. People trained with them or just used them in mock battles for fun. But no serious person used something that looked or even acted like a gun in the grid for the sake of use in the grid. They'd have their sword shoot out beams of energy, or a ring that let them shoot out of their hand, or just give their avatar the ability to shoot directly out of their eyes. They had even seen one hacker who had just manifested the shots in front of herself. That bad design did the exact opposite for Kai that had been intended, and they relaxed considerably as they lifted their watch up to check the time. But it wasn't the time that they were checking. Instead, a small red light appeared on the watch, turning it into a compass that pointed directly at the target. 3 buildings down, they were close enough to suspect that the target was in the building. The 12 security bots that were in front of it also helped suggest that. Kai circled the building slowly, but there was only one entrance. It didn't even have windows. That left them without many choices. Trying to get past the bots would guarantee security was triggered, but using one of the hacking tools would only make it more likely. So they opened the briefcase carefully and reached far deeper into it than the physical appearance of the box would suggest was possible. They pulled out a large, thick piece of green chalk used for drawing on sidewalks. In the physical world, people often used it to warn that the corporate police were in an area, or pass along messages since the news was written and published by the corporations. Kai began to write on the metal side of the building. It should have been too smooth for the chalk, but it had been designed with this type of default digital building in mind. As they drew the door onto the wall, it injected the program they had written into the building's code, creating a door. It didn't look much like the one Kai had drawn. It was simply a smooth metal door with a recessed handle that you might miss if you didn't know it was there. That wouldn't buy them much time, but every second counted in a job like this. The door opened smoothly, and they stepped into one of the most secure buildings in one of the most secure grids in Syliscape. The smart thing to do would have been to put out a few of their handwritten viruses, and then get out before enough of the building was eaten away that people began to notice. Instead, they continued forward. The digital artifact that Kai needed was too dangerous for any corp to have, but it was too precious to destroy. Not that they didn't have multiple viruses primed to be set off as soon as they logged out, forcibly or otherwise. The opportunity to hurt Omnisynth was far too tempting to not take advantage of, and it was still better to destroy the artifact than let any corp have it. The interior was a maze of hallways, 100 stories tall and far bigger than the exterior of the building. It was a labyrinth that would have stumped Theseus. In meat space, that would have been overwhelmingly expensive to build, but even in the digital realm, no one was carefully laying out hundreds or thousands of miles of twisting tunnels. That meant that it had been made by an algorithm. Kai didn't have access to that algorithm, and hacking deep enough into the system for it would be risky. But they were able to create a map, and as they did, their own programs began to predict the maze that the algorithm would make. It was tricky because this wasn't a physical space, and so a path that would in the physical world cross itself didn't here. But after about a half hour of walking, the mapping computer began to, occasionally, predict the correct paths. They allowed it to do that, moving down the paths that it suggested. Even the wrong paths helped to refine the program, and they soon found a stairway. The next level was the same thing. A good programmer who knew how someone would get through the maze would have altered the algorithm on each level, making it take far more time. But the person making this either didn't know that, or wasn't being paid enough to care because Kai found only 5 dead ends on the second floor, 2 on the third, and 1 on the fourth. After that, they might as well have been walking down a long straight path for how much it slowed them, and they began to relax. They didn't even have to give the mental commands to walk anymore, allowing the avatar to move on its own and do so faster than they could have. 100 floors were still insane, but each one was faster than the last, and 20 minutes later, Kai stood at the top floor. There was no maze here, only a single huge room, far bigger than could be logically built in the real world, at least without pillars to hold up the roof. That roof was also hundreds of feet higher than it needed to be. At the center of the room was the artifact. They had expected a glowing cube or something equally cinematic. But it was too old for that. This was from the early days when the corporations had experimented with new technologies rather than just monopolizing the old ones. It was a helmet with several wires connected to suction cups. They gave the creator of this a bit more leeway than the people who made the city. This had been made before they even called it the grid, and making things connect more directly to what they looked like in meat space had made more sense. And it was a brilliant piece of technology. They once again considered just destroying it. The artifact, if the rumors were correct, allowed you to alter the memories of anyone who could connect to the grid. Even limited to small changes to one person at a time, that would allow a company like Omnisynth a massive advantage. It also could explain why the CEOs of most corporations never entered public grids, forcing anyone who wanted to change their memories to get physically close to them. It would also give them a huge advantage in the battle against the corporations who had destroyed society and killed Kai's older brother. There was nothing and no one else here. So they double-checked the code of the artifact. It didn't appear to be a decoy. So they grabbed it and threw it in the briefcase as fast as they could. They had been expecting the alarms, and so didn't slow when they started. Instead, they began to run. They had two choices: go back into the maze or up into the unknown. They didn't have time for the maze, so they went upward. And they got lucky. They stepped out of the doorway at the top of the stairs onto the roof. But as they moved through, they turned back and saw that the door and the stairs were gone. This was a one-way path. It had to be, if they wanted the maze to mean anything. They immediately tried to log off. All they had to do was get out of the physical headquarters of Omnisynth and get the artifact to a secure location so the rebellion could use it. As they tried to log off, the edges of their vision began to glow red and words appeared in their vision. Security lockdown in place. Logouts disabled. Cursing silently, Kai began to run. They had known it was possible, but hoped they wouldn't be trapped in here. Still, they weren't stupid enough to have come here without a plan. And as they jumped off the roof of the 100-story building, they tried to remind themselves that this wasn't real. Heights were one of the things that still got to them, even in the digital world. Jumping from the top of the building gave them enough vertigo that they felt their stomach rush up into their throat, and the world began to swim. But there was no real danger from the fall. The danger was from the many security bots, and the best defense against them was speed. The good news was that if they could get back to where they had logged in, they'd be able to safely disconnect using one of the scripts they had paid piles of cash for. Getting one that would have disconnected them anywhere was well outside of their budget, and even this one had taken 3 major jobs to pay for. It was well worth it. They struck the digital street more like a rock than a superhero. But they didn't have time to worry about how they looked. They just began to run. As they did, the bots appeared everywhere, and Kai had to admit that their size, which had seemed absurd when they were walking by, was more impressive when they were grabbing for you or shooting at you. The suit and briefcase did their job admirably. The most important thing was that it made it difficult for the bots to track their exact location. That meant that the grid couldn't just send every bot to where Kai was at, they had to spread out. Though every time one of the bots saw them, it was able to tighten that focus. That was where the other aspect of the clothes came in. The first shots from the bots were common damage types. Much of the grid had been built on the back of video games, so every attack had its own type. The most basic and common was almost entirely blocked by the suit. Because of that, Kai was able to shrug off the first few hits. But then one of the robots ignored its gun and just attempted to restrain them. They barely slipped out of its grip, but knew that the time for subtlety was over, so they grabbed the huge weapon that the bot wasn't carefully securing as it tried to hold them. They didn't shoot it immediately. Just like in the meat realm, you had to jailbreak a weapon before it would work for you. But unlike the meat realm, all it took here was understanding the code well enough. And Kai had hacked into things every day for years, so it took only about 10 seconds to unlock the gun. Whoever had made the guns had put more effort into them than into the buildings. There were dozens of different settings. You could adjust the weapon to almost any type, increase the amount of energy, and even turn on rapid fire. Kai ignored the safety settings of the gun and turned everything to max. This wasn't their weapon, and if they needed to shoot more than a few times, then it probably wouldn't matter anyway. There was also no real point in shooting at the bots behind them. Kai wouldn't win a fight against all the bots the system could send after them. But when 2 bots stepped out in front of Kai, they fired. Kai was again impressed by the weapon. They felt the heft of the recoil. It wasn't like in the physical world where it would have hurt or knocked them on their ass, but it felt almost as real. The 2 bots in front of them exploded as the shots hit them. The gun felt hot in their hands, but they continued forward, jumping over the flaming pieces of metal and molten plastic that would despawn in a few seconds, but were still in their way. Another shot hit Kai in the back. It knocked them forward and they felt the pain. It was real pain, not in the back where they had been hit, but in the neck. The security had found something that did real damage, and a few more of those hits would be enough to burn out the connection. That would log Kai off, but the spike wasn't just connected to the grid, it was connected to their brain, and brain damage was a real possibility whenever you burnt out tech in your brain. Kai was forced to turn, slipping between 2 buildings. There was less room to dodge, but the only bots that could shoot them would be directly in front or behind them. One of the bots appeared at the far end of the narrow alley, but the gun was already aimed in that direction, and with 100 shots a second, Kai barely had to aim. Another explosion told every one of the bots where Kai was, and as they rushed out of the alley, shots began to fire. Another hit them, and this time the spike remained hot in their neck. As the next shot hit them, they reached the spot where they had entered this grid and triggered the script. In almost the same movement, Kai reached up in meat space and pulled the spike from their neck. It burnt their hand, and so Kai left the spike on the ground. They didn't need it anymore, and Omnisynth would figure out what spike had logged in illegally and block it anyway. Their heads still fuzzy, they reached up and touched their nose. Blood came away. That last shot must have done some real damage. But there wasn't any time to think about that now, so they grabbed one of the needles and shot enough stims into their hip to keep them going for at least a few hours. If they weren't someplace safe by then, they'd be dead. Resisting the urge to check the computer to make sure that the artifact really had transferred with them, they instead cracked the door and looked into the hallway. Omnisynth, like so many corporations, had less real security than digital security. And why not? The building in meat space wasn't much more than a good way to log into the grid where all the real work was done. That didn't mean Kai couldn't be shot. A lot of hacking jobs failed because people acted safe once they were off the grid. So Kai started towards the exit quickly but carefully. Getting outside didn't mean Kai would be safe. Omnisynth had jurisdiction anywhere in the city. But at least they shared that jurisdiction with a handful of other corporations, and so it might limit what they did. They'd still kill Kai without thinking about it, of course. No one would question a corp cop shooting someone unless they had a lot more money than Kai, but they might not drag her back for questioning. But getting outside was still a good first step, and just like in hacking, you had to focus on the first problem before the next mattered. As they neared the exit, they saw that the security wasn't as bad as they had hoped. There were 4 well-armed guards, each of them bigger and stronger than Kai. Kai might surprise one with their knife, but 4 would never happen. That only left one real option. Kai slipped into one of the empty rooms they hoped was close enough to the guards. It was time to test the power of the artifact, and hope it worked as well as everyone suggested. Connecting to it was trivial. There was security in the program, but while most things had stagnated under corporate rule, the one thing that hadn't was security. And with every improvement in security tools, the tools to circumvent it had to get better as well, so that something even 5 years old was child's play to hack, and this was almost 200 years old. With that, they loaded the code into their personal computer. Then they scanned for people they could connect to. Their broadcast ability was short range. Used mostly to make payments, but the guards had good grid connections. That wasn't surprising. Even the poorest person could afford a wireless connection these days. The corporations made sure of it because it was hard to make money off someone if they couldn't even get access to your services. There was no good way to know which of the names that popped up were the guards, so Kai simply used the artifact on everyone in range. They didn't know how well it would work, and it was possible that they would walk out and immediately be shot, but what other choice was there? The memory they added was of seeing Kai many times in the past. It was a vague memory that suggested they were supposed to be here, but without the specifics that might get caught up. And the artifact was more impressive than they might have expected. It created visuals and feelings based on Kai's own thoughts as it showed them the memory before it was implanted. They almost remembered seeing themselves walking into and out of the building every day, but they knew it was fake. After waiting a few seconds, Kai walked out of the room and tried to look as bold as they could as they walked towards the exit. "Sorry, you. No one is allowed to leave the building until the lockdown is complete," the guard said. Kai hadn't really considered that it might be a full lockdown. The executives hated that, and most of the time, security didn't do anything that upset the executives, but this artifact was one of the main reasons that Omnisynth had been able to keep a dominant position as a corp for the last 200 years, and losing it would do more than upset the executives. "Who do you think issued that order, you dolt?" Kai said, doing their best to sound like one of the executives, but they had avoided anyone who wore a suit or a uniform their entire life, so couldn't be sure they were as dismissive of their own security as they were everyone else. "Then you must know how important it is that no one is let out," the man said. "Of course I do. And did you see me ask to be let out?" Kai said, pivoting to a new plan as they added, "But there was a disturbance at the west entrance. You and you, go figure out what is happening." They pointed at two guards at random, and within seconds, half of the defense of this exit was gone. Not as good as the guards simply letting Kai leave, but good enough. Kai waited, somewhat awkwardly, for about 30 seconds, putting their hand up to their ear as if they were getting messages a couple of times. The implanted memories must be working well, because no one had questioned them being there. Once Kai was certain that the other guards were far enough away to not hear, they acted. Kai always tried to avoid killing, but this was too big to worry about her conscience, so they moved quickly. The larger of the two guards was caught entirely by surprise as the knife struck him in the side. A single stab wound in the side from a small knife wouldn't have done a lot, but while it was a knife, Kai hadn't come unprepared. It sent a jolt of electricity through the hilt. Enough to stun the guard, and more importantly, it burnt out the guard's computer. That might not kill him. It depended on the quality of the tech, but he would be all but worthless until it was repaired. Being able to follow simple orders, but not much else. The other guard was a bigger problem. The knife's charge was spent, and while it might have enough juice left in it to sting someone, it wouldn't be disabling any more tech until it had been recharged for 6 or 10 hours. It was still a knife, and they still had the advantage of surprise for a few seconds, so they did something the guard wouldn't expect, and drove the knife not into their side, but into the back of the man's gun hand. He dropped the gun, but his massive offhand grabbed Kai. Kai had always been the smallest one in a fight. That was one of the reasons they had become a hacker, rather than doing the easier jobs. No single smash and grab hurt the corporations as much as a hacker doing a job, but for every person that could sneak into a corp and pull off what Kai was attempting, 100 people could raid one of their stores. That was one of the reasons why the corporations focused on digital goods that could be controlled, even if stolen, assuming someone like Kai hadn't hacked it. But Kai had still had their share of fights. The corporation's goons didn't leave people alone because they were small. They used them as safe and easy ways to look tough, at least until you proved you weren't safe. And the key to that was to do what Kai was doing now. Fighting dirty. With one hand injured and the other grabbing for their throat, the guard wasn't able to easily defend their face. Kai instinctively balled their hand up into a fist, but that wouldn't work. The guard would be hurt and then crush Kai's throat. So they gouged at his eyes. Even that wasn't enough to get the guard to let go, but it kept him from actually killing Kai immediately, and they were able to grab the knife that was still stuck in the back of the guard's hand. The guard didn't react to that pain either. That was bad. Omnisynth must have splurged for pain-blocking tech for their guards. That limited the options considerably, as did the armor. They almost stabbed it in the other arm, but unless they cut something vital, that wouldn't do much now that the pain blocker had been triggered. But with him trying to lift them off the ground by the throat with one hand, the guard revealed one of the weaknesses of the armored vests they wore. They were vests. More comfortable, cheaper, and they didn't slow them down as much in a fight, but without sleeves, the armpit could be exposed. Driving the dagger into the armpit was easier than most places, and it did a lot of damage. The most important, since the pain and even nerve damage may not help, were the major arteries. Blood loss would weaken someone, no matter how much tech they had implanted. The fight continued for a few more seconds, as Kai struggled to avoid having their throat crushed as the guard reached out with their injured hand. But the guard made no effort to stop the bleeding, and after a few seconds, he let go of them. Kai started towards the door, then stopped as the man fell to the ground. He would bleed out in seconds, so they reached down, pulling the small cord on the side of the armor. That would trigger an emergency response and give him a fighting chance to survive. He was just doing his job, and didn't deserve to die for that. Once outside the building, Kai began to blend in. They had never been good at that, but with the crowds of people, it was difficult for the guards who began to stream out of the building to find them, giving Kai time to craft another memory. This one was a bit more devious. They crafted memories of seeing the wrong person in the building. A man strong enough to win a fight against two of their guards who blended in perfectly with the typical executive. That didn't actually cover up the memories of who they were supposed to be looking for, but it was stronger than the blurry image of Kai in the security cam footage, and with every second, they slipped further into the city and towards the underground until they slipped into one of the safe houses that the gangs used around the city. Normally, this wouldn't be safe for long. Part of the reason that the gangs kept the safe houses as an open secret was so that they could sell the people who used them to the corporations. An odd dance, as the gangs needed to let people use them safely enough, but still make money. But in minutes, the artifact once again did its thing. The gangs remembered getting huge bribes from Kai, and the corporate goons nearby remembered other safe houses that were more likely to be where Kai was hiding. Mostly places where the gangs would feel they needed to defend. As they changed the memories of hundreds of people in seconds, Kai wondered how much of the history that they and everyone else remembered was real, and how much was simply the memories implanted by the artifact. But no matter the truth, things were going to change now. And they planned on making the world better for everyone. Author's note:
Cyberpunk isn't a genre I go into a lot. I like the cyber part well enough, but I'm not sure many people would call me punk. That said, there are few genres of stories better suited to a good action story. And while I do try to touch on other themes, one of my goals with this story was to refocus a bit on making the stories fun and entertaining, because while I do think the best stories are the ones that ask important questions and explore facets of humanity, I also think that they need to be fun. And I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. If you did, you can get free stories every week from my newsletter at www.anscifi.com, or get access to over 30 patron-exclusive stories at patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.